Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J, and in celebration of the 20th review being uploaded last week, I did the one thing that everyone tells you not to do on YouTube, read the comments. Admittedly, given that my channel isn't all that large, I can afford to do so, as the outright malicious responses aren't all that common, which is a fact that I am both thankful for and wish to cultivate. As such, for whenever I get interesting feedback, criticism, or what have you that I think is worth discussing, I'm thinking of showcasing it on a video like this. This video in particular will focus on scattered criticism on videos from my review series. To start us off, let's look at 2 points from my Baldur's Gate review. Both of them mention difficulty, and mostly focused on what I presented in the video, namely that it took me a lot of tries to get past a really nasty bunch of kobolds in the first real dungeon. The first comment noted that what I encountered was to be expected, because virtually no one can survive at that range, and for most people, ranged weapons are mandatory until level 4. Given my interaction with Icewind Dale, that appears to be the case, as bows and crossbows are shockingly effective in what I've played thus far. The second point also brings up that, given the amount of trouble I was having, I could have easily dropped the difficulty to get past it, which is a fair point. My problem with doing so, however, is somewhat a matter of principle. In theory, if an area is designed properly, then I shouldn't have to mess with the difficulty to get past something difficult. Also, if I end up dropping it once, am I doing so to get past a difficulty spike or just to be lazy? In the case of the latter, my concern would be that I wouldn't try approaching the situation any differently, and it wouldn't force me to reconsider how I'm handling the situation. In fact, that same idea is playing into what I've done thus far for Icewind Dale. I've run into some really hard points, but because I didn't drop the difficulty and have been trying different ways to move forward, I've been able to keep making progress despite having what some could rightfully call a suboptimal setup. Either way, I understand your point, but I think I've got just a little too much pride built up to do that, even if all the waffling I just did means nothing. As to the first point brought up by that second comment, I did know about the Enhanced Edition before making this video, and since I hadn't played any of it nor knew much about it, I didn't think it was worth mentioning. That might sound dismissive, but Through the Looking Glass was meant to look at the old versions of games, warts and all, to see if they're worth looking back on. I have no doubt the Enhanced Edition improves a lot, especially on a technical level, but for the purpose of an old school review, it didn't make sense at the time to bring up the remaster. At least I had an excuse with Planescape Torment to not bring it up then, because it didn't even exist when I did the review. Before we tackle the more substantial responses, let's cover one more loose comment on my original Descent review that, from what I can tell, seems to be mostly about splitting hairs, but does have some good points. Firstly, while I was dismissive of the scoring system, as arcade-style point scoring isn't something I'm interested in, he does mention that when you see points added to the score, you know that what you're shooting at is indeed gone. This was something I knew about but failed to mention, and I've used it in every Descent game now despite that fact, without really thinking about it. Also, I do understand how to win the level 7 boss fight. My complaint against it was mostly the fact that it was a difficulty spike and not that it was impossible. And to finish working our way up, I can't remember enough about the Vulcan to dispute your point about it technically not being a hit scan weapon, but given the fact that every other weapon is a projectile weapon in the traditional sense, to the untrained eye, it is effectively a hit scan weapon, as there is very little that can be done to dodge it outside of taking cover. I do appreciate its use for stealth gameplay, which was a nuance I didn't pick up on, so again, thank you for bringing that up. As for the Vulcan robots, I think the disconnect we're having is that you seem to be someone who is very familiar with the game and played it a lot more than I did, which is totally fine, and I can understand why you presumably really like the game. The issue is that, for a newcomer, I didn't know where they were, and when you first run into them, I remember a lot of the time it was after turning a corner to find it fairly close to me, which meant when I heard the abrasive sound effect they make before shooting, it was usually too late. If I did have distance or foresight, I might not have complained as much, but again, since I was unfamiliar with the game before sitting down to play it, there was only so much that could be done. So with those out of the way, let's talk about something fascinating, Planescape Torment. I will admit that I'm surprised at the responses I got. Not only because they were insightful, but because this video ended up being the most watched review thus far, despite very little effort to advertise it on my part. So, without gushing too much about the subject, let's dive into the feedback. To start us off, let's tackle something basic. Yes, I did finish Planescape Torment in about 30 hours, and I was just as surprised as this comment was about it. The main reason for this is because there was a lot of side content that I missed. As while I said this game compelled me to explore more than I normally would, that doesn't mean I still explored every nook and cranny. Off the top of my head, I didn't get to the bottom of the Silent King, interact much with the Many as One, open the mysterious box, explore much of the Hive or the people in it, and didn't get the Lady of Pain angry at me. Knowing what I do now about the contents I missed, it doesn't in any way surprise me that you can spend more than 70 hours with the game, especially if you took your time with the writing. Anyway, I also had a couple of comments that were confused as to why I was annoyed at the attribute checks. To clarify, I like the idea in theory, at least with regard to role-playing. If I choose to play the Nameless One as an utter imbecile, then I'll end up with different results than I would otherwise. My issue was more of a personal misgiving, as my sense of a good story and what's required for that was clashing with my sense of power within the game itself. Because I tend to play a lot of action RPGs and Dota-style games, I'm used to stat improvements being focused purely around the gameplay, and I'm used to being pandered to as the player in terms of feeling awesome. That's not what Planescape Torment is, however, and my misgivings came from personal feelings of inadequacy, and because, while I intuitively knew why they would block off story options based on my attributes, the gamer and child in me didn't want to accept it. With traditional D&D, it's not the same for me because, in that case, it's effectively structured improvisation. Here though, since I know it's a computer and that there might be another option, it doesn't quite sit right with me. Since that I felt that way, I mentioned it because it might also be a factor for other people. And that mentality I had feeds into what is probably the most insightful comment I've gotten on a video to date, which addresses what I saw as forced exploration. When I started the game, I went into it hoping for an amazing story, and for the most part, that's what I got. However, I saw the insistence that I must explore certain areas to get to what I was most interested in to be frustrating and unnecessary. And yet, this comment asked the simple question, what if that was the point? His reasoning is better than any paraphrasing that I could do, so I'll just read it verbatim. To your despising the forced exploration, this is true, but I feel that it actually adds to the immersion because this is probably really similar to what it would be like being the Nameless One, not being able to remember anything. It's noticeable that in the game, you rarely actually have to do all the snooping around if you already know ahead of time where to go. This makes second run-throughs and beyond quite odd and a different experience altogether, because you already know where to go ahead of time, kind of like a new incarnation of the Nameless One who can actually remember stuff. The fact that it isn't enjoyable to be forced into such exploration is the whole point. You get to properly roleplay as the Nameless One stumbling through a confusing world that he cannot remember anything about. This is why there is so much reward for exploring in the first place. The game designers are making sure that what the player is being forced to do is still enjoyable, even if they're reluctant to do so in the first place. This is why I consider the game to be art. It communicates messages, and these messages aren't always meant to be enjoyable. They're meant to evoke emotions across the full spectrum of emotions. They're meant to get the cogs in the head spinning and working hard. They're meant to feel taxing at times and jubilantly rewarding at times. Judging from the mixed range of tones coming out of your review, I'd say this was successfully conveyed by the game designers. It's not about a lack of faith in design, nor is it necessarily a lack of faith in the agency of the player. It just so happens that there are very many responses that we as humans can have that we will not necessarily slip into by default. Experiencing an artful taste of torment might not be what most people will go into a video game to achieve, but this game forces it on you, and I think most people come out of the other side at least changed, and that is the point. Okay, so apparently I'm bad at paraphrasing because I can't help but change the grammar to better match how I normally speak, but I think you get the point. The only place where I can really go against that is, again, by saying that I like to be in control, which only feeds into the argument, and that they might have taken it too far, such as requiring you to join the Society of Sensation in order to continue on. Another comment further down said that they could also do a better job at conveying that fact, but since I'm not sure how you would do that without breaking immersion, it's not something I can complain about. And finally, to end the discussion, I'm going to focus on a more general piece of criticism regarding my StarCraft Brood War review. There was plenty of criticism levied at how I approached the story discussion, which is certainly valid and I will work to fix for next time, as I definitely could have phrased things better. However, the feedback I really wanted to focus on is the fact that I focused almost exclusively on the campaign. With regards to the skirmish mode, you got me there. I should have spent a couple of matches testing the limits of the AI, but since that's not something I do all that often in games, it's not something I thought about. I know that's a terrible excuse though, and I'll work to do that for the next one. With regards to the multiplayer, I explicitly avoid covering multiplayer-only games in this series because, while I would love to know what it was like to play them firsthand, everyone still playing it is bound to be a million times better than me. I can accept losing over and over in a Dota-style game because I can usually walk away feeling like I learned something or improved to some degree. That's not the case when the matchmaking can't bridge the gap between literal years of experience, if matchmaking even exists. So as much as I would love to cover Brood War's multiplayer, that is going to be a solid hell no. As for the arcade, that's a thornier subject. At first I was largely in agreement with the people asking about that, especially since it's a modding scene that by the game mode Aeon of Strife would be transformed into Defense of the Ancients in Warcraft 3, and create the genre which I've spent probably the most time in ever. The fact is that everything is better with mods, as they can add new and original content, address some of the issues with the game which the developers didn't, and increase the longevity of the game overall. On the other hand, Everything is better with mods, as they can add new and original content, address the issues with the game which the developers didn't, and increase the longevity of the game overall. In other words, any and all criticism of the game could either be downplayed or eliminated purely by invoking what should be an internet rule: if a video game exists, there's a mod for it. Admittedly, that doesn't extend as much to console games, but if I started factoring mods into every review, then it could rapidly turn into every video being a variation of, this game has X, Y, and Z wrong with it, but it's got mods, so everything is still okay. That might be somewhat an exaggeration, but with how old the games I review are, I doubt that's far from the truth, especially with something as well known as the StarCraft arcade. Because of that, moving forward, I am going to have a simple rule for how I handle mod support. While the existence of a thriving mod community can demonstrate a passion within the game's community for said game, they are not necessarily a sign of quality from a newcomer's standards. As such, if I find that a modding community for a game seems to be much larger than usual, I will mention it for the purpose of an introduction, but it will not in any way factor into my recommendation. In order to maintain the scope of the reviews, I have to focus purely on what the developer had to offer, and exceptions like the DXX Rebirth mod for Descent 1 and 2 will only be permissible if I am absolutely not enjoying a game without them, in which case there will be hell to pay during the review. So with that decision to get everyone mad at me over, that's all I have for this video. Thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and let me know below if you'd like to see more videos like this, assuming I get enough comments to be worth continuing. Either way, I've got the next review to work on, and a really busy week ahead of me on top of that, so here's to another 20 more reviews when I finally stop being lazy about it. So, speaking of not being lazy, I'm gonna jump into the next game I'm working on, and we'll see you all later.